Story number 1. The highway that wound through the northern marshlands had grown used to being alone at night. It slithered between black water and crooked pines, a pale ribbon of asphalt that seemed to hover above the wetlands rather than cut through them. On nights like this one, when the fog came rolling in from the low, standing pools, the road felt even more like a bridge between worlds than a stretch of state-maintained pavement. Earl's rig was a quiet island of light and sound in all that gray. The dashboard cast a soft green glow over the cab, every gauge steady, every needle behaving. The heater hummed with a low, even breath, and the faint rattle in the passenger side door played counterpoint to the soft murmur of the AM radio. It was a comforting set of noises, familiar company for a man who had spent more nights than he could count with only mile markers and truck stop coffee for conversation. He had taken this route more times than he could remember, but never this late in the year and never with the fog this thick. It pressed against the windshield in slow, crawling swirls, absorbing the headlights and returning only a pale, milk glass smear of visibility. The world beyond the guardrails had disappeared. Even the pines were just the vague impression of darker shadows shifting at the edges of sight. Earl leaned forward over the wheel, squinting, his hands resting easy but firm at 10 and 2. The road felt narrower than usual, like it was shrinking under him. Yellow lines slipped by. White reflectors popped into existence just ahead of his tires and vanished instantly in the rearview mirror. The monotony of it did something strange to the mind, like staring at a single point until the entire room began to breathe. The radio buzzed and crackled, the late-night host droning softly about a call-in show on Dreams. The voice was soothing, lulling, almost blending into the white noise of tires on asphalt. Earl wasn't really listening, only letting it wash over him, until the host's tone shifted, and there was a flicker of static that seemed to sharpen the sound. "We've got Earl on the line," the host said. Earl frowned faintly, the reaction slow, as if it had to wade through the fog to reach his mind. Then he smiled to himself. Another Earl somewhere out there, another trucker probably, rolling down some lonely highway. There were always repeats and similarities in names on these shows. The caller that followed, though, sounded like him. Not just similar, like him. The same soft drawl worn smooth by years of talking mostly to himself. The same rhythm he used when he was thinking his way through a story. "Yeah, I'm out here on 37 North, the voice said, a little rough at the edges. "Fog's real thick tonight. Can't see much past the hood." Earl felt a thin, cool line of sensation draw itself between his shoulder blades, like someone had tipped a thread of ice down his back. His grip on the wheel tightened almost imperceptibly. Highway 37 North. Marshland. Fog. He glanced at the radio, then quickly back at the featureless road ahead. "That's so," the host asked smoothly. "What's on your mind tonight, Earl?" There was a pause, a breath. Earl could hear the faint sound of the caller shifting, maybe adjusting his headset. Earl's own seat creaked slightly at the same time, a nervous fidget he hadn't meant to make. "Well," the caller said slowly, "I was thinking about this stretch of road. How sometimes it feels like it ain't as empty as it looks." Earl swallowed. The heater clicked, adjusting its cycle. Outside, the fog grew denser, falling in thicker drapes across the windshield. He could see it twisting under the beams, little tendrils reaching out as if they wanted to touch the glass. "There's stories about that highway," the host continued, the tone mild, almost amused. "Truckers talk, some swear they've seen things." The caller chuckled quietly, a sound that made Earl's chest tighten because it was his chuckle, turned back at him through the speakers. "Yeah, seen things, heard things. I've run this route a long time. It's funny how the road starts to remember you." The rig's engine gave a low, steady rumble. Earl's eyes flicked to the side mirror on instinct, though there was nothing to see but the soft gray blur of his own trailer lights fading into fog. His reflection in the mirror was a faint shape, his features smudged away by distance and moisture. For a moment, it looked as if someone else was sitting in the driver's seat, just out of focus. The voice on the radio continued, unhurried. "Sometimes, real late, when the fog's like this, I get this feeling like there's another set of headlights back there, but when I check, it's just me. Just the lights of my own trailer bleeding into the mist. You ever get that, host?" "I think a lot of us have felt watched on an empty road," the host replied. "Lonely stretches can play tricks with the mind." Earl listened, his heart beating a little faster now, though there was no real reason for it. Nothing had changed, he told himself. It was only a coincidence, a common name, a familiar highway, stories that truckers liked to tell when the night got long and the coffee went lukewarm. But the sensation of being watched crept up anyway, gentle but persistent, like cold seeping in under a closed door. He glanced in the rearview again. This time, for just a second, there was a pair of lights far back in the fog. Not bright, more like two distant candles hovering above the road. They flickered subtly, then smoothed into normal, circular beams, growing a hair closer before dissolving when the next bank of mist rolled in. "Sometimes," the caller said, "I hear my own voice on the radio before I've called. That's the one that gets me. Like maybe the road runs in circles we don't see, and our words loop back around before we even speak M." Earl's mouth had gone dry. He cleared his throat softly, more to reassure himself that he was still there, still real, still separate from the sound coming out of the dash. His fingertips tingled where they met the worn leather of the steering wheel. The host chuckled, but the sound felt thinner now. "You're scaring my other listeners, Earl." "Just talking," the caller replied. "Anyway, I got this sense tonight that I ain't the only Earl on this road. Like maybe there's another me a little ways ahead, driving through the same fog, listening to the same show, thinking the same thoughts. Ever feel like that? Like you've already driven the next mile and you're just catching up to yourself." The road stretched on, featureless. No exits, no overhead signs. The mile markers had begun to feel irregular, like they appeared a bit too soon or a bit too late. Earl slowed his rig a touch, letting the speedometer dip a few miles per hour. It felt like a small act of defiance against whatever script the radio caller was following. He switched his gaze between the windshield. The side mirrors, the faint glow of the GPS. The device showed his rig as a small arrow inching along a sinuous line, surrounded by empty digital green. No upcoming turns, no nearby towns. The estimated arrival time ticked forward by a minute, then another, as if the truck were moving through something thicker than air. The caller's voice softened. "If you are out there, other me, you ought to watch that curve up ahead, the one that ain't supposed to be there." Earl's breath caught. His eyes snapped fully forward. The road, which had been laid straight as a ruler across the marsh, now showed the faintest suggestion of a bend ahead. Not sharp, just a gradual, lazy lean to the right, the white lines slipping off-center under his headlights. There was no curve like that on 37 North. He knew this route, had known it for years. It was notorious for its straightness, a single unwavering line cutting across miles of bog. The GPS screen, however, remained stubbornly straight. No upcoming deviation. His hands moved on the wheel almost of their own accord, following the subtle suggestion of the road's shift. Asphalt whispered under his tires. The fog thickened into a tunnel, the edges of his vision closing in until it felt like he was driving down the center of an endless, dim corridor. "Thing about that curve," the caller went on, voice barely above a murmur now, "is that it doesn't always lead somewhere different. Sometimes it just loops you back to the place you've already been. And you don't notice, 'cause the fog covers the seams. You only catch on when you start hearing echoes, like a radio playing the same conversation twice." The host said nothing this time. The line hummed faintly. Earl could hear the blood in his own ears, the soft, quickened rhythm of his breathing. He watched as another pair of ghostly headlights appeared up ahead through the mist, at the exact angle and distance his own must look like from behind. They didn't move toward him. They matched his pace perfectly, hovering at a fixed point beyond reach, as if he were chasing his own reflection through the fog. Then, very gently, the caller on the radio inhaled. The sound was identical to the breath Earl had just taken. "You still with us, Earl?" the host finally asked, his voice oddly small. There was a pause, a space where an answer should have been. Then softly, in a tone that seemed to arrive from both the speakers and the silent cab at once, came the reply. "Yeah," the voice said, "I think so." Earl reached for the radio, hand trembling just enough that he could feel it. He flicked the switch. Silence fell in the cab, thick and immediate, like another layer of fog settling over him. The only sound was the steady, unbothered hum of the engine, the low hiss of the tires, the soft rattle in the passenger door. The curve eased out eventually, sliding back into an arrow-straight road that could have been any mile of highway he'd ever driven. The fog began, very slowly, to thin. Shapes emerged at the edges, the skeletal silhouettes of trees, the dark gleam of marsh water, a lone reflector post leaning at a tired angle. In the mirror, there were no more trailing headlights. In front of him, only empty road. Earl drove on, the cab warm around him. The dashboard lights a steady, familiar glow. The GPS beeped quietly and adjusted his arrival time back to what it should have been, as if correcting some private misunderstanding. After a long while, he turned the radio back on. Music filled the speakers, an innocuous soft rock ballad halfway through. The host's show had moved on or ended. No mention of any trucker named Earl. No eerie caller on a foggy highway. Just songs, commercials, the everyday chatter of a world that pretended nothing unusual had happened. He kept listening anyway, mile after mile, waiting for some stray word, some slip in the smooth, ordinary patter that might acknowledge the shared curve in the road that wasn't on any map. Nothing came. But on certain foggy nights, years later, when the marshland swallowed the world again and the road narrowed down to a ghostly stripe under his wheels, Earl would catch himself glancing at the radio more than the mirrors, listening not for what was being said, but for the quiet spaces in between. In those thin, hushed moments, when the static rose just a little and the lights ahead and behind seemed to flicker in perfect unison, it felt like the highway remembered him too. Story number 2. Out in the high desert, where the land rolled flat and patient beneath a huge sky, there was a stretch of highway that most truckers simply called the empty. In the daytime, it was a long ribbon of pale asphalt between low scrub and distant, sleeping mesas. At night, it became something quieter and stranger, a dark thread that seemed to stitch together the spaces between towns, between thoughts, between waking and dream. On this particular night, the fog came from nowhere. Marisol noticed it first as a faint grayness on the horizon, an odd smear along the black line where earth met sky. It wasn't the kind of place you expected fog. The air was usually bone dry out here, the stars sharp and close. But as her rig rolled mile after mile under the soft, constant thrum of the engine, that distant gray rose up and settled down over the highway like someone slowly lowering a veil. By the time her dashboard clock clicked over to 2:14 a.m., the fog had thickened into a low, glowing river across the asphalt. Her headlights tunneled through it, catching individual swirls and eddies as if she were driving over a lake of quiet, white smoke. She shifted in her seat, rolling her shoulders back. The cab smelled faintly of coffee and the citrus cleaner from her last fuel stop. On the passenger seat, a half-empty thermos tilted gently with each tiny change in the road. The radio muttered soft late-night music, the notes blending with the hum of the refrigerated trailer behind her, a constant cool heartbeat at her back. The plan had been simple: push through the empty, hit a familiar truck stop just before dawn, catch a few hours of sleep before delivery. She knew the landmarks, the way the road curved around a dry riverbed, the old billboard for a long-closed tourist trap, the sequence of exits that ticked down toward civilization. But the fog dulled everything. Road signs appeared out of nowhere, slick with moisture, their green faces ghost pale in her beams. The dry scrub on either side had dissolved into soft, indistinct mounds. Even the sky seemed closer, the stars blurred and far away, as if the whole desert had pulled a blanket up over itself. Marisol leaned closer to the windshield, her breath slightly fogging the glass from the inside. The heater was set low, blowing a gentle stream of warmth across her legs and the center console. Outside, the world looked strangely small, just a cone of visibility with edges that frayed and slipped away. She flicked her eyes to the GPS. The little arrow marched along as it always did, but the map looked oddly bare. The next labeled exit, the one for her usual truck stop, was still 20 miles away, far enough to be comfortable usually. Around her, the dark felt thicker than it ought to. The CB crackled once, a burst of static like a cough in a quiet room. She hadn't heard another driver on the channel in over an hour. This late, this far between cities, it wasn't unusual. Still, she turned the volume up a notch, listening. Nothing but the gentle hiss of an unclaimed frequency. The fog deepened. Now it lay in soft layers, some parts thinning, others bunching up like folded cloth. Every now and then, she'd pass through a pocket where visibility dropped to almost nothing, the world compressing down to hood length and the immediate swipe of wipers. Those pockets were the worst, tiny, soundless rooms she was forced to drive through, trusting the straight line of the road and the quiet intuition in her hands. She checked the time again. 2:27 a.m., the numbers glowed in calm green. The second hand on the small analog clock above it seemed to tick a fraction slower than usual, each motion deliberate, almost thoughtful. A sign appeared ahead, pale and blank at first, its letters leaping into legibility only when she was almost on top of it. Service 2 miles. The word was generic, unhelpful. No logo, no brand, no list of food or fuel or lodging, just the assurance that something existed up the road. Marisol frowned lightly. There wasn't supposed to be anything here. She knew this stretch. The next proper exit wasn't for another 15 miles. She checked the GPS again. The map showed only empty highway, the faint outlines of topography, no upcoming turnoffs. She drove another mile, slow and steady, trying to convince herself she'd misremembered the distance. The fog shifted, grew a shade lighter as if some unseen light source was diffusing through it. The radio song ended. An ad began, the announcer's voice bland and cheerful, talking about a hardware store in a town she'd never heard of. Then the next sign loomed, an arrow pointing right. Service, exit 143. But her digital display at the edge of the dash insisted. She just passed mile marker 117. She felt a small, quiet knot form under her ribs. Not fear exactly, more like a careful awareness, the way one might feel stepping into an unfamiliar room in a familiar house. Her fuel gauge was at just under half. She didn't need to stop. She told herself that once, then again. But the thought of the usual truck stop, now strangely distant and abstract, did not bring the comfort it usually did. Out here, wrapped in fog, the idea of another place with light and warmth and other people, even sleepy or strange people, had a pull she could feel. She put on her signal. The small clicking noise filled the cab, precise and insistent, as she guided the rig onto the exit ramp. The fog seemed to brighten around her. As the truck left the main highway, the ramp curved gently downward, the guardrails slipping by on either side like the edges of a tunnel. The asphalt under her wheels felt slightly different, not rougher or smoother exactly, just older, as if the tires were rolling over something with a longer memory. At the bottom of the ramp, the fog thinned just enough to reveal a parking area, a line of street lamps, and beyond them, a low building with a wide, beckoning glow. The diner's windows were all lit, rectangles of warm amber spilling softly into the night. Neon humming somewhere out of sight painted the fog faintly pink and blue. The sign above the building was simple, a metal rectangle with peeling white paint and the faded outline of a coffee cup. Whatever name it had once boasted was unreadable from this distance. Marisol pulled into the lot, eased her truck into a wide, empty space among painted lines that gleamed faintly with moisture. There were no other rigs, no cars, only her truck, the diner, and the quiet halo of light around them both, encircled by fog that seemed to press close like a listening crowd. She shut off the engine. The sudden absence of the diesel rumble was startling. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, not even the distant whoosh of passing traffic. Then softer sounds emerged, the faint whir of her trailer's refrigeration unit ticking over on backup, the tiny tick-tick of cooling metal, the distant, comforting clink of cutlery, and low murmur of voices from inside the diner. It felt like stepping off a ship onto a still, illuminated shore. She shrugged on her jacket, the fabric crackling faintly in the quiet, and climbed down. The air was cooler here than it had been on the highway, with a dampness that touched her hair and eyelashes. The fog smelled faintly of dust and coffee, of wet asphalt and something warm cooking. Beneath it all was the underlying scent of the desert at night, dry earth and distant sage, trying to make itself known through the moisture. The bell over the diner door chimed when she stepped in, a soft, old-fashioned ring that seemed to go on a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The interior was a gentle explosion of warmth and color. Red vinyl booths, their surfaces softened and cracked by years of use, lined the windows. The counter stretched along the opposite wall, its stools topped with faded teal cushions. The air inside was a blend of coffee, frying onions, and something sweet, maybe pie or freshly baked bread, undercut by the clean, crisp smell of bleach on linoleum. A jukebox in the corner glowed quietly, its glass front reflecting tiny, fractured copies of the room. A slow, melancholy song from some long-ago decade floated out, the words low enough to be almost indistinguishable. There were a few patrons scattered around, a man in a plaid shirt and work boots nursing a mug at the far end of the counter, an older woman in a floral dress sitting by herself in a booth, hands wrapped around a cup she seemed not to be drinking from, a pair of teenagers hunched over a shared plate of fries, their heads closed together as if sharing secrets. None of them looked up when the bell chimed. The waitress did. She stood behind the counter, a coffee pot in hand, her uniform a soft, sea-green color with white trim. Her hair was swept back in an easy knot, a few strands escaping to curl at her temples. There was a name tag pinned just above her heart. It said Marisol. For a moment, truck cab Marisol simply stopped. Her breath paused, her hand on the strap of her bag tightening just slightly. The fog outside the windows pressed its pale face against the glass, making the interior of the diner feel like an island floating on a muted sea. The waitress smiled, small and calm, as if nothing were out of place. "Well," she said, her voice warm and familiar in a way that made the hairs at the back of Marisol's neck stir, "you finally made it in on a foggy one." Marisol found her own voice, a beat later than usual. Have we met?" The waitress tilted her head, considering the question as if it required more thought than it did. "Feels like it, doesn't it?" she said gently. "Sit wherever you like. Coffee?" "Yeah," Marisol said automatically. "Please." She chose a booth midway down, the vinyl sighing softly under her weight. From here, she could see almost the entire diner, the length of the counter, the door, the jukebox with its slow, changing lights. The clock hanging over the kitchen window read 2:14 a.m., the second hand ticking with deliberate precision. But she had left the truck at 2:32. The waitress appeared at her elbow with a mug already full, the steam rising in twisting streams that mirrored the fog outside. The coffee smelled rich and dark, just on the edge of bitter, exactly the way Marisol liked it, though she hadn't spoken a word about cream or sugar. "You been on the empty long?" the waitress asked conversationally, pouring herself a mug with her free hand. "Couple hours," Marisol replied. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The ceramic was pleasantly hot, the heat seeping into her fingers and grounding her. Fog came out of nowhere. "It does that," the waitress said. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the windows, where the world beyond was now only vague, shifting light. "Has a mind of its own, I think. Likes to gather things up." "Gather things up." The waitress's smile returned, thinner but still kind. "Thoughts, memories, people who forget what mile they're on." She sipped her coffee, eyes on something far away that wasn't out the window or inside the room. "Don't worry, it usually lets go again." The man at the counter shifted on his stool. The teenagers laughed at something only they had heard, the sound soft and blurred. The woman in the floral dress lifted her cup for the first time, took a small sip, and set it down with great care. The jukebox changed tracks with a mechanical clunk just slightly louder than it should have been. A new song began, this one that Marisol knew. Her grandfather had loved it, playing it on faded tapes in an old pickup, long before she'd ever thought of driving anything larger than a bicycle. She took a cautious sip of coffee. It was perfect, exactly the right temperature, the right strength. For a moment, the haunting familiarity of it all eased, replaced by a simple human gratitude. "You get many trucks through here?" she asked. The waitress' eyes flicked to the door, then to the parking lot she couldn't quite see. "Now and then," she said, "mostly when it's like this. They don't always remember they stopped, but they get where they're going a little less tired than they should be." She glanced down at the name tag on her chest, then up at Marisol, an unreadable expression in her gaze. "You'll get where you're going, too." Marisol's hand tightened around the mug. "That's my name," she said quietly, nodding toward the small silver rectangle. The words sounded faint in the wrapped, insulated air of the diner. "I know," the waitress replied just as quietly. In the brief silence that followed, there was a sound low, familiar, a vibration more than a noise. The deep, thrumming idle of a diesel engine, very close. Marisol's heart hopped once in her chest. Her rig, someone had turned her truck on. She half rose from the booth, then stopped herself. She forced her gaze not to snap toward the door, not to break the slow, careful rhythm of the moment. "You left her off," the waitress said, not quite a question. "I did," Marisol swallowed, the coffee warm and solid in her stomach. "Reefer on, but the engine." "Quiet," the waitress finished for her. "Mostly." She set her own mug down. "The empty can be a long place when you're by yourself. Sometimes it borrows the shape of your own truck to keep you company." "That doesn't make any sense," Marisol said. But the protest came out gentle, like she wasn't entirely committed to it. "Most things that keep us sane on the road don't," the waitress said, and there was a hint of tired affection in her voice. "Finish your coffee. You don't have long." "How much do I owe you?" Marisol asked, surprising herself with the question. Some part of her had already decided that leaving was something that would happen eventually, even if the thought felt vague and far off. The waitress looked at her for a long moment, then smiled in a way that felt almost proud. "You'll pay it forward," she said. "Next night the fog comes down and some other driver talks to a voice on the radio or follows a pair of lights that aren't really there. You'll keep going when you're not quite sure why. That'll be enough." Outside, the engine sound ebbed, then rose faintly again like a tide. The clock above the kitchen window clicked over from 2:14 to 2:15, and for a brief instant, both times overlapped in her vision, as if she were seeing two layers of reality barely out of sync. The teenagers slid out of their booth, leaving their plate of fries untouched. They walked toward the door, silent now, their faces smoothed out, distant. The bell chimed once when they left. No lights swept across the windows from a departing vehicle. No doors thudded shut. The man in plaid vanished somewhere between one glance and the next. One moment he was there, hunched over his mug. The next, the stool spun very slightly, all by itself, easing to a stop. The woman in the floral dress met Marisol's eyes across the room. There was gratitude there, and weariness, and a quiet understanding that felt older than both of them. Then she, too, was simply not there, her cup still half full on the table. The jukebox wound down, the song trailing off in a slow, sleepy fade. The soft mechanisms inside it hummed, but no new selection began. "You should go," the waitress said softly. "The fog's changing. If you stay much longer, it'll find new ways to keep you." "Are you?" Marisol began, not quite able to finish the question. "I'm whoever the road needs me to be," the waitress said, and now her smile was undeniably kind. "Tonight, I'm someone who pours good coffee and reminds you that you're not the first to feel a little unmoored out there. That's enough." Marisol stood slowly. Her legs felt steady, more so than they had an hour ago. Had it been an hour? The clock over the kitchen said 2:16. Her watch said 3:03. She decided not to compare them again. At the door, she paused and looked back. The diner was quiet but not empty. It held the echo of voices, the trace warmth of recently vacant seats. The waitress, her double, her shadow, her future self or past self or something else entirely, lifted a hand in a small wave. "Stay between the lines," she called softly. "And if the fog starts talking, just let it. It gets bored sooner or later." The bell chimed as Marisol stepped out. The night pressed in, cool and damp. The fog had retreated a little from the immediate edge of the parking lot, forming a low, luminous wall a few yards away. Her rig waited where she'd left it, vast and solid, beaded with fine moisture. The engine was silent. Only the soft murmur of the refrigeration unit broke the stillness. She laid a hand on the driver's door. The metal was cold but real, its familiar texture under her fingertips anchoring. For a moment, she listened, half expecting to hear another heartbeat inside, another version of herself shifting in the seat. There was nothing, just the wide, patient silence of the desert wrapped in fog. She climbed in, closed the door, and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, staring at her own face in the rearview mirror. Her features were the same as always, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a softness, or maybe a recognition. The dash clock read 3:07. The GPS showed her parked on the shoulder of the empty, no exit, no service road. Just a straight line of highway hovering between faint contours of land. Her fuel gauge was unchanged. Her coffee thermos sat where she'd left it, cool to the touch. On the passenger seat, a paper napkin she didn't remember having fluttered slightly in the breath from the vents. There was writing on it, in a looping, tidy hand. "You'll be fine." Her own name was scrawled below, in ink that hadn't quite dried, the tail of the last letter smudged by a careless fingertip. Marisol took a long, slow breath. Then she started the engine. The rig rumbled back to life, familiar and grounding. She pulled gently onto the highway. The fog folded around her once more, but this time it felt less like a wall and more like a curtain she was parting, mile by patient mile. 20 minutes later, the lights of her usual truck stop appeared ahead, hazy and welcoming. She pulled in, parked among a small forest of other rigs, and stepped down into the ordinary clatter and hum of a place firmly attached to the map. Inside, the diner was fluorescent lit, busy, full of the comforting racket of plates and conversation and tired jokes. The waitress behind the counter wore a bright orange vest over her shirt, her name tag proclaiming Lucy in bold letters. The coffee was serviceable. The pie was dry. Everything was exactly, reassuringly as it should be. But when Marisol sat down, she found that she missed, just slightly, the quiet glow of the fog-shrouded place, the soft hum of the jukebox, the other her pouring coffee with hands that did not tremble. Out beyond the truck stop's circle of light, the empty continued on in both directions. On some distant night, in some deep pocket of rolling mist, a low building with warm windows might wait again, for whoever needed it. Story number 3. The mountain highway that curved along the coast was called the Crow's Spine, and on nights when the fog came in off the ocean, it earned the name. It arched and dipped and twisted through the dark like a long, pale vertebrae, clinging to cliffs that fell away into black water far below. Guardrails shone briefly in headlights, then vanished. Pines crowded close on the inland side, their trunks tall and straight as watchmen. Jonah had been running the spine for almost 20 years, but never quite this late, and never with the marine layer this thick. The clock on his dash glowed a steady 1:48 a.m. as his rig climbed, engine humming low and confident, a string of gauges casting soft amber and green halos around the cab. The familiar smells of coffee, oil, and old vinyl wrapped around him like an old jacket. Outside, the world had shrunk to a tunnel of light. Fog pressed in against the windshield, not drifting so much as flowing, pale and dense, like milk spilled slow motion across the dark. His wipers whispered back and forth, smearing beads of moisture into faint, glistening arcs. The road beneath his tires was a narrow band of damp black, centerline glowing faintly yellow, edge line fading in and out as if it were thinking about disappearing altogether. Jonah sat high in the seat, shoulders relaxed but alert, big hands quiet on the wheel. The crow's spine demanded respect, even in good weather. Tonight, with visibility narrowed down to the reach of his headlights, it felt less like a road and more like an idea he was being asked to trust. The radio had faded to faint static a few miles back. No stations up here at this hour. The only sound was the steady drone of the engine, the soft rush of air past the cab, and the occasional clink of something small shifting in the overhead compartment. The CB, usually a buzz of chatter even deep in the night, sat quiet on channel 19, its display a small, patient red square. He thought about switching it off, then left it, habit, like leaving the porch light on. The fog thickened as the highway gained height, swallowing whatever starlight had been filtering through the clouds. Every curve came on him faster than he liked, emerging at the last moment from the white as a subtle tilting of the asphalt, a new angle of guardrail, the brief suggestion of a reflector post leaning out of the mist. He eased off the throttle, letting his speed drop to something that felt like caution rather than fear. Ahead, the road sign for mile 62 loomed out of nowhere, its numbers slick and silver in the beams. Jonah nodded to it out of reflex. A few minutes later, maybe more, maybe less, time felt slightly syrupy, another sign rose up. Mile 62. He frowned, straightened a little. The same lean of the post, same triangle of bullet holes in the metal clustered around the bottom corner. He'd noticed them the first time because they made the sign look like it had freckles. The GPS on his dash insisted he was advancing neatly along the route, its tiny arrow edging northward. The digital mile count ticked over from 62.3 to 62.4. Somewhere behind the fog, the world followed its old, reliable cartography. But here in the cab, wrapped in whiteness, it felt for a fleeting moment as if he'd driven in a small, careful circle. "Too much coffee," he muttered, though his thermos sat barely touched in the cup holder. He might have dismissed it as a trick of the mind, if not for the voice that came through the CB, a breath later. "Any northbound on the spine, you copy." It broke through the static cleanly, a low, familiar growl that made Jonah's fingers go still on the wheel. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 10 years, not since the day they'd put Henry's old Mac in a yard for good and told stories about him over truck stop eggs. Jonah's throat worked once. He reached for the mic without taking his eyes off the pale, shifting road. "Go ahead," he said, his own voice sounding a touch rougher than usual in the small, insulated space. "Fog's thick where you are?" the voice asked. Jonah swallowed, thick enough. There was a beat of silence, just the faint hiss of the channel. Then the voice came again, tinged with something that sounded like quiet amusement. "Thought so. You just passed mile 62 twice." Jonah's gaze flicked to the CB unit as if the speaker grill might give up a secret. The display showed 19, nothing unusual, just a square of red in the dark. "How'd you know that?" he asked. "Same way you did," the voice said. "Been up here in it." Jonah was aware, distantly, of the way his heart had sped just a notch. Not the wild slam of panic, just a firmer beat against his ribs, keeping time with the gentle vibration of the steering column under his hands. The rig rolled on, tires hissing over damp pavement, headlights carving small hollows in the fog. He cleared his throat. Henry. The name felt strange coming out, like setting down a keepsake he'd kept wrapped up for too long. A soft chuckle came back over the speaker, achingly familiar. Took you long enough, kid. Jonah blinked. He wasn't a kid and hadn't been for a long while. But for a moment, sitting there high above the cliffside road, fog pressing close, he felt 30 again, second seat in Henry's Mac, watching the older man's hands move easy on the wheel. You're not, you know you're. Gone, Henry supplied without irritation. Sure, they put me in the ground with my boots on and everything. Doesn't mean I can't ride along now and then. Keep an eye on the bad stretches. The crow's spine curved lazily right. Jonah followed it, gentle on the wheel. He could see almost nothing beyond the guardrail, just a faint, lightless drop. The smell of salt hung in the cold air leaking through the edges of the door, mixed with wet rock and evergreen. He let the silence sit for a moment, listening to the soft rasp of his own breath. The CB hummed quietly, as if it too were waiting. You figured out the loop yet? Henry asked. What loop? Jonah said, though his eyes had drifted back to where the last mile marker should be. The fog's got you running the same mile over and over when you're not looking, Henry said. You don't feel the seams cause you're driving smooth, but you'll keep passing 62 until you notice the wrong thing. As if on cue, another sign rose up out of the white. Mile 62. This one had no bullet holes. The post was straighter, the number a cleaner white. It was the kind of detail you only caught when your nerves were tuned just a bit tighter than usual. The wrong thing, Jonah repeated softly. Next'll be the pine with the split trunk, then the rock face with the white streak down it like a scar. Henry's voice softened. Listen to me now. This part you did once, years back, not so different to this one. I talked you through it then too. Jonah's mind flickered, trying to grab hold of the memory. There were so many nights, so many miles blurring together. Faces at truck stops, voices on CB, rain and heat, and the long, patient stretch of land always unwinding ahead of him. Had there been another fog like this? Another loop? The beams of his headlights slid across a tree on the right, its trunk dividing into a perfect Y halfway up, two branches reaching like arms. A pine with a split trunk. His shoulders tensed, then deliberately eased. The GPS still showed progress, 63, 63.1. Reality steady as ever, but the road itself felt like a record with a skip. You could drive it all night, Henry said quietly. Burn a full tank on the same 3 miles. Some folks do. Get so turned around they forget there's an end to it. What did we do last time? Jonah asked. We slowed down, Henry said, and we stopped trusting the line on the screen more than the paint under the tires. Ahead, somewhere just beyond what he could see, the rock face waited if Henry was right. Jonah could almost picture it, a sheer wall of mountain rising out of the fog, streaked with some mineral vein that caught the lights just so. He passed 100 like it on 100 roads. Another voice murmured faintly through the CB then, layered under Henry's like a distant echo. A woman's, tired but steady, saying something about visibility down to nothing at mile 62. A second overlap, like multiple channels sharing the same thin strip of air. The sound raised the skin along Jonah's forearms, but not unpleasantly. It felt like being in a room where more people were present than you could quite see. The fog ahead brightened a hair, taking on a paler shade. His headlights picked up texture rock, this time, rising sudden and close on the left. Moisture slicked its face, turning the mineral streak into a long, pale line that glowed faintly. There, Henry said, you see it. I see it. Next piece is the trick, Henry went on. Road, gonna want to lean you left, hug that wall. GPS'll say you're doing fine. But the old line, the one that doesn't loop, drifts just a hair to the right before it bends. That's not how they laid this stretch, Jonah said automatically. He knew the engineering reports on these roads better than some dispatchers. Not anymore, Henry agreed. They straightened it after that slide took out the shoulder, but you remember the old one in your hands. You did it over and over till your knuckles knew it better than your eyes. A drop of moisture slid down the inside of the windshield, catching a stray bit of light. For a moment, it looked like the world outside was crying. The fog, one enormous, held breath. "Trust me," Henry said quietly, "just once more." Jonah eased his foot off the accelerator until the truck was rolling at a crawl, engine hardly doing more than an idle. The steering wheel was warm under his palms, the familiar leather worn smooth where his grip usually sat. He loosened it further, feeling out the faint camber of the road through the tires, the barely perceptible tilt that told him how the asphalt had been poured, where water wanted to run when it rained. The line of paint at the edge wavered in his beams, sliding subtly toward the drop. Ahead, the faint suggestion of a curve clung close to the rock face, an invitation to keep hugging the mountain. He remembered Henry's old Mac on a night years back, remembered the way the older man had nudged the wheel, murmuring, "Road thinks it knows better than me, but I was here first." Jonah let his own hands follow that ghost of emotion now, allowing the truck to lean ever so slightly away from the obvious path. The tires hummed over a seam in the pavement that his eyes hadn't registered, a faint, almost apologetic bump, like crossing an old scar. For a heartbeat, everything tightened. The fog seemed to hold itself still. The engine note pitched up half a tone, then dropped. The GPS stuttered, the little arrow on the screen quivered, flickered back along the line for a fraction of a second, then snapped forward as if deciding something in his favor. And then, just like that, the loop let go. The fog ahead parted in a vertical line, like curtains drawn back by an invisible hand. The pale wall became two, sliding away from each other, revealing a stretch of road that dipped down and away, a gentle run toward a pool of darker sky. The air in the cab felt fresher. He could smell the ocean again, stronger now, with a hint of wet grass and the faint metallic tang of distant rain. Behind him, if he had looked, there might have been a brief shimmer on the road, a double exposure of the truck he was in and some other version of it, trapped in a bend that no longer existed. But he didn't look. He kept his attention ahead, letting gravity pull him down the grade. The CB crackled softly. The woman's voice came through clearer now, no longer doubled under Henry's. "Copy you on 62. Fog's easing up past the overlook. Just keep it slow, drivers. You'll be out of it soon enough." Henry's voice had grown faint. "Told you," he said, as if they'd simply finished an ordinary conversation about weather. "You always were better at listening to the road than the gadgets." Jonah managed a small smile. "You sticking around?" "Nah," Henry said, almost fond. "Got other miles, but I'll hear you when you're on this stretch. You talk more than you think you do when you're alone." The channel hissed once, like a sigh, then settled back into its low, empty hum. The fog thinned steadily as the highway unwound down the mountain. Patches of sky appeared, dark and deep, pricked with a few stubborn stars. The guardrails flashed silver and receded. The world opened up, little by little, until Jonah could see the faint suggestion of waves far below, ink black and moving. Up ahead, a small turnout appeared, its sign barely visible but familiar, Scenic Overlook. He passed it a dozen times, never bothered to stop at night. Tonight, without entirely deciding to, he clicked on his signal and eased the rig carefully onto the flat, paved shelf. He set the brakes and turned off his headlights. Darkness rushed up for a moment, pure and velvety. Then his eyes adjusted, finding edges in the starlight and the distant glow of a town miles down the coast. For a long moment, he just sat and listened, to the softened tick of cooling metal, the faint hush of the ocean below, the very distant whoosh of someone else's tires miles away on some other road. The CB was quiet. Then low and almost too soft to be sure of, he heard it, the rumble of a familiar engine idling nearby, different from his, older, with that particular uneven purr he'd once been able to pick out in a crowded lot. He turned his head toward the darker end of the turnout. For an instant, in the gray between one blink and the next, he saw shapes, the suggestion of a row of trucks parked nose out, some with rounded noses long out of style, one with the distinct, square-shouldered silhouette of Henry's Mac. Their running lights glowed dim as embers, amber and red and patient. The air around them shimmered faintly with moisture. He knew somehow that if he stepped out, walked over, he'd find nothing there but worn pavement and a few old oil stains. The rigs were like an afterimage on the eye of the road itself. He gave a small, respectful nod in their direction anyway. "Appreciate it," he said quietly, to no one and to all of them. A breeze rose from the sea, cool and damp, carrying the smell of salt and kelp. It slid through the cracked window, lifting the hair along his arms, then slipped back out. When he looked again, the far end of the turnout was just darkness and a tumble of rocks. He rolled back onto the highway a few minutes later. By the time the crow's spine delivered him into the valley, the fog was a only distant memory clinging to the tops of the highest pines. The radio stations came back one by one, filling the cab with human voices, ads for diners and mechanics, late-night love songs. The next day, at a truck stop cafe, he found an old framed map of the region hanging crooked on the wall. The crow's spine curved across it in a thinner, older line, with a sharp little kink near mile 62 that wasn't on any modern chart. Someone had drawn a tiny crow there in pen, perched right on the bend. Jonah stood looking at it long enough that the waitress refilled his coffee twice without asking. After that night, when the marine layer rolled in thick and stubborn, and the world outside his windshield shrank down to a soft white tunnel, he found that the fear never came quite as sharp. The unease was still there, the respect for what he couldn't see, but tempered now by the quiet certainty that the road remembered too. That in the humming wires above the asphalt, in the static and half-caught voices on Channel 19, there were old hands ready to make sure he didn't drive the same mile forever. And when he passed mile 62 on clear evenings, with no fog and the ocean shining far below, he sometimes reached over and tapped the CB mic, offering a simple, "All good here," into the night. Just in case someone was listening. Story number 4. The Flatland Highway cut straight through the heart of the country, a dark ribbon laid across miles of low fields and drainage ditches, power lines marching alongside it like quiet sentries. In summer, the land shimmered under heat. In winter, it lay bare and brittle. Tonight, in the brittle season's very center, it was wrapped in fog. Lena had been watching it form for hours. At first, it was just a low haze hanging above the fields, a ghostly softness between the rows of harvested corn stalks. Then it spilled, slow and certain, over the shallow ditches and toward the pavement, a pale tide rising to meet her headlights. By the time the dash clock eased past 1:30 a.m., the fog had claimed everything. The cab was its own little world. The dash lights cast a gentle wash of blue over Lena's hands on the wheel, picking out the pale lines on her knuckles, the small, shiny scar near her thumb where a ratchet strap had slipped years ago. The heater murmured low, sending a steady breath of warmth around her boots and up toward the sleeping compartment. The faint smell of truck stop coffee clung to the air, cut with the clean, cool scent of the outside that seeped in around the edges of the doors. Outside, there was nothing but white. Her headlights burrowed into it, turning the world ahead into a short, bright tunnel with blurred, indistinct edges. The high beams only made it worse, reflecting off the moisture like a wall, so she'd switched them off miles back. Now the road came at her in patient, narrow slices, the center line glowing faintly yellow, the edge line, a softer, retreating white that slid in and out of view, the occasional reflective post, appearing and vanishing like a thought half remembered. The GPS arrow, stoic and unwavering, crawled along the screen. The little box assured her she'd reach her next fuel stop just after 3 if she kept a steady pace. On the other side of the glass, time felt slower, thicker, like syrup poured in the cold. She hadn't passed another vehicle in at least 20 minutes. The CB, tuned to 19 out of habit, sat quiet on the dash. Even the far-off glow from farmhouses that usually dotted the horizon had been swallowed by the fog. The highway felt less like a road and more like a thread stretched taut through cotton. Lena rolled her shoulders, loosening muscles that had begun to creep toward tension without her noticing. She took a sip from the travel mug at her elbow. The coffee was tepid now, but familiar. The simple act of swallowing something warm made her feel a fraction more anchored. A sign loomed up out of the white, wet with moisture, its green face washed pale in the beams. Road work ahead. She blinked once. Road work out here at this hour in this weather. The GPS did not show any alerts. Dispatch hadn't mentioned a construction zone on this stretch. She ran the mental list of dot bulletins she'd skimmed earlier in the day and came up empty. Still, signs were signs. She eased her foot off the accelerator, letting the speedometer drift down a few notches. The big engine responded with a softer, rolling hum. 100 yards later, another sign rose from the fog. Speed limit 45, double fines in work area. The white numbers glowed in her lights. A thin film of fog beaded and slid down the reflective surface, catching and scattering the beams. Somewhere unseen in the night, a distant engine droned her own and nothing else. Guess somebody drew the short straw on shifts, Lena murmured, imagining a few unlucky workers huddled around portable heaters, orange vests glowing in the gloom. She slowed to 40. There was something about the sheer emptiness around her, the absence of any other light, that made the idea of blasting through a work zone at full speed feel not just wrong, but almost impolite. The highway, in this weather, felt like a shared secret. It didn't seem right to disturb it more than necessary. Ahead, the first orange barrel appeared at the edge of her lights, its reflective bands flaring bright, and then slipping past, then another, then a single sawhorse with a blinking amber light, its small, patient pulse cutting a steady rhythm into the fog. The light reflecting off the moisture did strange things. Each blink seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat after the actual flash, as if the fog weren't quite ready to give it back. The road narrowed between the barrels by a lane, guiding her gently left. The tires hummed over a faint ridge in the pavement where an old lane line had been ground away. "Didn't hear about this," Lena said softly, more to the cab than to herself. The CB crackled once, a brief burst of static like someone clearing their throat in another room. She reached for the mic, then hesitated. There was no voice behind the sound, just the soft, endless hiss of empty frequency. Then ahead, a new light bloomed in the fog, not orange this time, but steady amber white, low to the ground and moving slowly. She caught up to it gradually. As shapes emerged from the gray, she realized it wasn't a stationary beacon but the back of a small truck, some kind of work vehicle, with a light bar mounted high and a large, illuminated sign panel on the tailgate. "Follow me," the sign said in bright, insistent letters. The arrow beneath it pointed straight ahead. Her rig was big, her momentum heavy. She didn't like being too close to anything in low visibility. She backed off, giving the smaller truck a generous distance, watching the amber pulse of its light bar cut tunnels of brightness through the fog. The vehicle itself was odd. It had the boxy shape of an older maintenance truck, the kind she'd seen in childhood more than lately, heavy steel bumpers, squared-off corners, the suggestion of faded stripping along the side that her lights couldn't quite parse. The license plate was lost in shadow. The tires threw thin rooster tails of moisture as it rolled, the spray catching her beams in thin, luminous veils. On instinct, she reached again for the CB mic. Road crew ahead of mile 217. You got your ears on, she said, voice calm, steady. Northbound tractor behind your follow truck. The channel crackled softly, then settled back to its gentle hiss. No reply. The little truck sign did not change. Follow me, it insisted, unwavering. She considered her options. The barrels were thick on either side now, hemming her in. Beyond them, the fog pressed close, hiding whatever lay beyond the narrowed corridor of road. Turning around wasn't an option. Stopping in the lane in fog, behind a vehicle clearly expecting her to keep pace, felt worse. So she followed. The work truck held steady at 30 miles an hour. Its taillights glowed a deep red, softened by the moisture. The amber bar above them pulsed with a rhythm that slowly began to sync with her breathing, on-off, inhale, exhale. The repetition was oddly soothing. Unease dwelled alongside it, but it was the kind that sharpened the senses rather than fraying them. Time elongated. The GPS insisted she was covering ground. The mileage count ticked upward in neat tenths, but the world around her remained stubbornly the same. Pale barrels, dark fog, the glowing back of the truck. Now and then, the Follow ME sign would blur slightly, the letters streaking horizontally for a fraction of a second, as if she were looking at a reflection in water disturbed by a stone. Then it would snap back into crisp focus. She could smell wet concrete now, a chill mineral scent slipping through the vents and mingling with the drier air of the cab. Somewhere under it lay a hint of fresh-cut asphalt, sharp and oily. Beneath that, fainter still, was the smell of cold, damp earth, the kind you got from open cuts along the roadside. They passed a portable generator on the shoulder, its shape hulking in the fog. No sound came from it. The thick cable running from its side simply vanished into the whiteness. Floodlights stood dark and unused on tall metal stalks, turned away from the road. "Be nice to see one of you," Lena muttered, scanning the edges of the beams for the flash of a vest, a hard hat, any sign of a living crew. The only movement was the breathing fog and the steady roll of the Follow ME truck. The CB gave another faint crackle, then resolved for a moment into something that might have been a voice, a low murmur, half-formed consonants, just at the edge of hearing. It reminded her of listening to conversation in the next hotel room over, present, distinct, but not quite decipherable. She turned the volume up a notch. The hiss swelled gently, wrapped around her, then faded back to its previous level. The work truck ahead signaled left with a slow blink of its indicator. The barrels shifted, too, angling inward. The corridor of road curved, not sharply, but enough to require attention. She followed the truck's arc, feeling the subtle change in centrifugal pull, the faint, telling slide of weight in her trailer. Her inner ear told her the road wanted to stay straight. The curve felt like something laid atop the original path, not fully fused. Her fingers tightened on the wheel for a moment, then loosened again. "Easy," she told herself. "You're not the first to take a detour in fog." A shape loomed briefly at the edge of her light. An old bridge, she thought, or what had been one. Concrete rails with chunks missing, rebar showing through in twisted, rusted tangles. The middle was simply not there. The land dropped away into fog, then rose again on the other side where a new structure gleamed faintly, its modern lines ghostly in the mist. Between them, the detour lane she was on skirted along the very edge of the cut, a temporary bypass that hugged the hollow. The pavement under her tires changed pitch, a slightly different texture, older and more pitted. Without the guiding truck, without the barrels, it would have been nearly invisible in the fog. A cool sensation slid down her spine, not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness of how thin the margin could be between safe passage and a very different kind of night. The Follow ME truck's brake lights flared briefly, then eased off, setting a new, even slower pace. Its sign did not waver. If anything, the letters seemed brighter now, the white of them almost bluish against the amber glow. Lena thought of all the hours she'd driven alone, trusting in paint and signage and the quiet competence of strangers whose names she'd never know. The ones who built and patched and redirected the great veins of road that held the country together. Tonight, the idea of an unseen crew somewhere in the fog, keeping an eye on her route, felt more comforting than unnerving. Another voice brushed the CB channel, clearer this time but still distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. Take her slow past the washout, fog's common and thicker on the westbound. There was a rustle of paper, the clink of a thermos lid. None of it sounded quite modern, the timbre of the voice, the cadence, the faint hum of old fluorescent lights in the background. It could have been transmitted years ago, or now, or both. The detour lane straightened. The smell of cut earth faded, replaced by the broader, open scent of flatland again. The pavement smoothed out beneath the tires. The barrels began to space themselves farther apart, their reflective bands growing less insistent in the beams. Up ahead, the Follow ME truck sign flickered once, then changed. Resume speed. Lena almost laughed. The absurdity and the relief braided together into a sound that came out half breath, half chuckle. Copy that, she said to the empty cab. She let the rig climb gently back toward highway pace, careful not to surge. As she did, the work truck's amber light bar dimmed slightly, the pulses slowing. Its taillights grew smaller in her view. Then, very gradually, it began to fade. It didn't turn off onto a side road. There were no other exits here, no breaks in the digging fog or the lines of barrels. One moment the little truck was there, its boxy outline clear, its lights a comforting beacon. The next, it was more suggestion than shape, a smudge of brightness within the white. Lena blinked, leaned forward a hair, unwilling to trust her eyes completely. The truck's outline thinned, stretched, and then the fog ahead was just fog again, blank, undisturbed with no taillights to follow. Her stomach did a slow, measured roll. She glanced at the GPS. It showed open highway. No current work zone, no detour, just the straight line of the route humming along. She checked the mirrors. No barrels, no narrowed lanes. The road behind her, as far as she could see, was just blacktop and fog. Her hand stayed steady on the wheel, but she was aware of the fine tremor in her fingertips, the way her pulse had crept up into the hollow at the base of her throat. "Okay," she said aloud because sound made things feel less slippery. "Okay." The CB crackled once more. The same old voice floated through, softer now, almost tired. "That's the last one tonight. Let M through in the morning." Another voice answered, too muffled to make out. There was a brief scrape, like a chair being pushed back, and then only static again. The channel settled into its low, unremarkable hiss. She drove in silence for another half hour, the fog slowly thinning until dark shapes of trees appeared at the edges of her world. The lights of a rest area sign bloomed up ahead, the familiar logo of a chain truck stop, promising fuel and coffee and other people. She pulled in under the canopy, the sudden fluorescence almost harsh after the subdued whites and grays of the fog. The lot held a handful of other rigs, their silhouettes hulking but reassuring. A man in a stocking cap walked his dog along the fence, the white puff of his breath visible in the chill. Inside, the smells were ordinary and blessedly terrestrial. Frying food, burnt coffee, cleaning chemicals, the faint sweetness of packaged pastries. TVs muttered in corners. The tile underfoot was scuffed and solid. At the counter, she asked the clerk if he'd heard anything about night work up the highway. He shook his head, scanning her coffee. "Not tonight," he said. "They had something going on a few years back after a culvert washed out, but that's all redone now." "Why?" "Just saw some barrels. Looked like a crew moving equipment," she said lightly, unwilling to put more words to it here under fluorescent lights. "Not in this weather, they wouldn't," he said. "Guys don't like fog any more than you do." She thanked him and drifted over to the cluttered bulletin board by the door, more to give herself something to look at than from any real interest. Among the faded ads for mechanics and the handwritten notes offering shared rides, there was a photograph pinned slightly askew. It showed a group of highway workers standing in front of a maintenance truck. The truck was old, its paint a pale, nondescript color, stripping barely visible. On the back, a rectangular sign panel was bolted in place, dark and unlit in the daylight of the photo. One of the men had scribbled a date in the corner. It was nearly 20 years old. Lena's gaze lingered on the truck. Even without the lights, without the words spelled out, she recognized the shape, the configuration of bar and bumper. She put a quarter in the charity jar beside the coffee stirrers, for no particular reason she could name, and went back out into the night. By the time she hit the highway again, the fog was lifting for real. Patches opened overhead, revealing thin, cold stars. In the east, a paling of the darkness hinted at the first curve of dawn. Driving back through that stretch a week later, under a bright, clear sky, she saw the place where the temporary detour had been. The earth was scarred there, a long, pale swath of older pavement curving gently away from the main line and back again, now blocked off by low concrete barriers. The new bridge stood tall and clean beside it, arching over a deep, dry channel. There were no barrels, no signs, no maintenance trucks. She rolled past at highway speed, steady and unhurried. The CB murmured with the usual chatter, weather reports, jokes, grumbles about dispatch. Somewhere under it, if she listened close, there was a faint, consonant murmur, the echo of a voice giving quiet instructions in a fog that was no longer there. Lena took a breath, let it out slow, and turned the volume up a notch. It was good to know, she thought, that on some nights in some weather, the road itself seemed to remember old dangers and old detours, sending out its own kind of escort. In the thin light of morning, with the field stretching away on either side, the experience settled into her bones not as terror, but as something else, a reminder that even on the loneliest stretch of highway, especially in the thickest fog, she wasn't always the only one awake and paying attention. Story number 5. The interstate through the northern pines was a line of quiet light drawn through a world of muffled dark. On either side of the pavement, the trees rose in ranks, their trunks straight and dark as pillars, their crowns lost somewhere above in low, crawling clouds. The fog had come down early that night, slipping through the branches and spreading across the ground until it lay in the hollows like lazy smoke. By the time Marcus had been rolling 3 hours without a break, the fog had thickened into something else. It wasn't drifting so much as sitting, a dense, low ceiling that swallowed up his headlights and pressed against the cab. The sky above was gone. The world ended 20 yards in any direction, soft-edged and colorless. Inside the truck, everything was steady. The dash glowed a muted amber, the lines of numbers and needles familiar as the veins on his own hands. The gentle vibration of the engine traveled from the steering column up his arms, a low, constant purr. The heater whispered at his feet, warm air curling up around his legs. It smelled faintly of dust and rubber and the ghost of spilled coffee. Marcus' hands rested easy on the wheel, but the ease was deliberate. Fog did something strange to the mind, especially out here where the interstate ran long and straight through trees that looked the same mile after mile. It took the ordinary and smoothed it down until even time felt soft. Up ahead, a sign emerged from the white, its green face shining wetly in his beams. Way station 2 miles. He almost passed it without really seeing, the words sliding across his vision like a half-remembered song. Then another sign came a minute later, closer, its letters sharper. Way station 1 mile, open, all trucks must enter. Marcus sat up a little straighter. That station never opened at night. He knew this stretch, had been running it long enough to know which exits had 24-hour diners and which rest areas had patchy lighting, and where the state troopers liked to sit just past a bend. The way station at mile 141 was always closed by dusk. Its empty parking lot was a familiar, dark gap in the tree line. Fog distorted distance, he told himself. Maybe he'd misjudged. Maybe this was a different station he'd forgotten. The GPS didn't list anything special ahead, just the pale line of interstate winding north through pale green contours. His little arrow crept along, indifferent to signs and fog both. Another marker rose out of the white. Way station 12 mile, open. The word glared a bright, insistent green in his headlights. The metal around the bolts was streaked with rust. Beads of fog clung to the face of the sign, slipping down in slow, glistening paths. Marcus eased off the throttle. The truck's big engine dropped to a lower, more thoughtful hum. "All right," he said aloud, his voice small in the insulated cab. "Rules are rules." The off-ramp appeared almost at the last instant, the right edge line bending away into the fog. He clicked on his signal, the soft tick-tick filling the cab, and guided the rig up the shallow curve. The fog on the ramp felt thicker somehow, closer. The trees pulled back a little here, traded for low brush and the vague impression of open space beyond. Sodium vapor lamps burned somewhere ahead, their light amber and sour, diffused so completely by the moisture that it seemed to hang everywhere and nowhere at once. The way station canopy rose out of the fog, a long, low structure of steel and concrete. The lane beneath it was empty. No other trucks, no cars. Just his rig, the gleam of wet pavement, and the low, humming glow of overhead lights. He rolled slowly onto the scale, feeling the platform take the weight of the tractor and trailer as a gentle shift under his tires. The digital display mounted on a pole ahead should have flashed his axle weights in red numbers. It stayed blank. Marcus frowned, peering through the streaked windshield. Maybe the fog was playing tricks. He craned a little, trying to catch any hint of red. The speaker, mounted above the lane, crackled softly. "Driver in lane 1, set your brake and bring your logbook inside." The voice was calm, measured, male. It held the dry, official cadence of someone who'd repeated that sentence 1,000 times. There was a faint burr of static around the edges, like a radio a hair off frequency. Marcus' hand had already moved to the parking brake before the oddness registered. He hesitated, then chuckled under his breath. How many nights had he spent wishing for human interaction, some break in the monotony, only to balk when he got it? He set the brake. The truck settled with a gentle hiss. The engine idled steadily, a low, reassuring thrum. His logbook was electronic, of course. No actual book. He grabbed the tablet with its blinking green display and shrugged on his jacket. Cold leaked in when he opened the door, fog fingers sliding into the cab. The air outside smelled of wet concrete and pine sap, with an undercurrent of old diesel and something faintly metallic. His boots rang softly on the steel grate steps. The world beyond his rig was a smeared watercolor of amber light and white mist. The station building sat to the right of the lanes, a squat shape with a band of windows. Warm light glowed behind the glass, blurred by moisture. Inside it was almost too bright. Fluorescent fixtures hummed gently overhead, their lights softened by nicotine-yellowed covers. The room smelled of stale coffee, paper, and a faint pine disinfectant. A long counter ran along one wall, behind which a row of monitors blinked. Some showed grainy shots of the lanes outside, others were dark, their screens reflecting only the empty room. On the far wall, a large map of the state hung under a layer of clear plastic, a spiderweb of colored pins marking points along the interstates. Beside it, a rack of clipboards drooped slightly, their metal clips dulled with age. A man sat behind the counter, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. His uniform was crisp, but of an older style, dark blue shirt with epaulets, state emblem sewn slightly higher on the sleeve than Marcus was used to seeing. The patch itself looked different somehow. Same shape, older colors. His hair was more silver than not, cut close. His face had the settled lines of someone who'd spent a lot of time looking at the same stretch of road. His nameplate read KELLER. He looked up as Marcus came in, eyes clear and steady. "Evening," Keller said. "Evening," Marcus replied, setting the tablet down on the counter. "Didn't know you folks ran nights out here." Keller's mouth tipped in a small half-smile like the beginning of an inside joke. "We don't, except when we do." His gaze flicked to the tablet. "Electronic logs, huh? Let's see what the machine says you've been up to." Marcus slid it over. The inspector's fingers were long and a little knotted, the kind that had spent years on wrenches and paperwork both. He handled the device with an ease that didn't quite match the old-fashioned room. The tablets glow-lit Keller's face from below. Lines shadowed differently under the odd angle, making him look both older and younger at once. Numbers scrolled under his fingertips. Hours of service, on-duty time, breaks taken. "You've been running nights a long time," Keller said after a moment, though the log only showed the current week. Marcus snorted softly. "Feels that way." Keller lifted his eyes, met his gaze. "You started on this run back when they still used paper, didn't you?" Marcus hesitated, a small private shiver chasing down his spine. "Yeah," he said slowly, "long time ago." Keller nodded, as if that settled something he'd already known. He tapped the screen once more, then slid the tablet back. "Logs look fine," he said. "Go ahead and leave that there for a minute. I've got something for you." He turned to an old metal drawer beneath the counter and pulled it open. The sound it made was familiar and oddly soothing, that scraped, weighty slide of steel on steel. From the drawer he took a wide roll of paper, its edge curled, and fed it into a narrow slot on the counter Marcus hadn't noticed before. A scale printer, an old one, beige plastic gone yellow with age. It whirred to life with a mechanical purr, spitting out a thin strip of paper. The sound of it printing was soft but insistent, like a distant sewing machine. Keller tore off the strip and laid it on the counter between them. There were numbers on it, faint and slightly misaligned, the product of an old machine, but they weren't axle weights. The heading at the top read in tiny, blocky letters: "Night Tally Southbound/Northbound Unit, 1943. Underneath, MILES on this road, 312,405. NIGHTS past midnight, 1,187. Fog crossings, 47. MISSED calls home, 23. Empty SEATS beside you, 1,187. Marcus stared. For a second the room seemed to tilt, not physically, but in the way a thought can tilt. "That's some kind of joke?" he asked, but his voice came out quieter than he meant it to. Keller's expression didn't change. He slid the strip a little closer with 2 fingers. "Scales weigh more than steel when the fog's thick," he said. "Road likes to check what we're carrying now and then." Marcus picked up the strip. The paper was warm from the machine, the ink a little smudged where it had come out too fast. The unit number printed at the top was his, down to the last digit. "I do," he stopped, regrouped. "How would it know that?" "That's the part above my pay grade," Keller said mildly. "I just man the desk when the station decides to open." Decides to open. Fog rolls in off the trees, visibility goes down to almost nothing, and the miles start stacking different. Keller leaned back on his stool. The monitor behind him showed a grayscale image of Marcus, rig on the scale, shrouded in white. "You run enough nights alone, you get heavy in ways the main line can't count. So every now and then it kicks you off, puts you on the scale, sees if you're still balanced." Marcus ran his thumb along the strip, feeling the tiny indentations where the printer head had struck. The list made a strange, precise sort of sense. The numbers weren't exact, he knew that, and yet, 47 times through a fog like this, it sounded right. 1,187 nights where his headlights were the only thing breaking the dark. "You're making it sound like the road's alive," he said, not quite joking. Keller shrugged one shoulder. "Alive? I don't know about that. Remembering, though, it remembers." He gestured lazily toward the wall of monitors. In one, long-past trucks rolled through grainy fog. In another, daylight scenes, clear sky, bright pavement, different rigs altogether. These don't all come from tonight. On the far left screen, a younger version of Marcus, or someone who could have been, stepped out of a different truck on a much clearer night, logbook in hand, walking toward this same building. The frame flickered once and shifted to an empty lane. Marcus' scalp prickled lightly, but there was no sharp fear, just a deep, odd recognition, like stumbling across an old photograph of himself he didn't remember posing for. "How many times have I been in here?" he asked. Keller's eyes softened in a way that made Marcus think of quiet rest areas and dawn breaking over empty lots. "Enough that the door knows you," he said. "Not so many you can't still change your route." The heater in the corner clicked softly as it cycled. Somewhere deeper in the building, a phone rang once and went silent, as if it had thought better of it. The fog outside thickened against the windows, turning them into luminous, indistinct rectangles. Keller reached for a rubber stamp on the counter. It looked heavy and well used, its wooden handle worn smooth. He pressed it into an ink pad with careful, deliberate force, then brought it down on the corner of the paper strip. The sound of the stamp hitting the counter was quietly decisive. "Cleared," Keller said. "You're good to roll. Maybe pull off for a nap before dawn if you can. Numbers like these, you don't have much left to prove to the dark." Marcus folded the slip in half, then in half again, the paper giving easily under his fingers. He slid it into the narrow pocket in his wallet where old receipts sometimes hid and nodded. "Appreciate it," he said. Keller inclined his head, as if accepting thanks for something smaller than what was actually being given. "Keep it between the lines," he said. "We'll be here when the fog's thick again." The air outside felt colder after the warmed, artificial light of the station. His breath puffed white in front of him, swallowed almost immediately by the mist. His rig loomed on the scale under the canopy, familiar and solid. For a moment he thought he saw, in the corner of his eye, another truck sharing the lane, an older model, paint darker, lines squarer. But when he turned his head, there was only his. In the cab, everything was as he'd left it. The engine idled patiently. The dash clock read 2:04 a.m., though he could have sworn he'd spent longer inside. The GPS showed his little arrow paused neatly over the way station icon, the arrival time at his next stop now a few minutes later. He pulled off the scale and eased back onto the on-ramp. The fog folded around the truck as soon as he cleared the canopy, erasing the station from view in his mirrors within seconds. 5 miles up the road, the mist began to thin. Tree trunks emerged more clearly. The sky above unrolled a few pale stars. His phone buzzed in its holder with a received message he'd missed earlier, from a niece 3 states away, a simple picture of a messy drawing, a "look what I made" accompanied by a cluster of hearts. At the next rest area, he pulled in for a brief stop. The building there was modern, glass front, vending machines humming, informational posters under bright lights. On a bulletin board near the driver's lounge, between flyers for tire shops and safety notices, there was an old, yellowing printout taped in place. State dot notice. Way station AT mile 141 closed until further notice. Date 12/02, 11 years prior. He read it twice. The edges of the paper had curled. Someone had drawn a smiley face in blue ink in the margin long ago. In his wallet, the folded strip of thin scale paper lay warm against the leather. When he took it out later, in the quiet of his sleeper berth, the numbers were exactly as they'd been. At the bottom, just beneath the stamped CLEARED, someone had written in a firm, tidy hand, "Rest when you can, the road can wait." The signature beneath was nothing more than a looping K, the ink slightly blurred as if written on a humid night. Marcus slept deeper than usual that morning, parked beneath the faint whisper of pine branches, fog lifting off the highway just beyond the lot. The interstate carried on without him for a few hours, lights spilling across it, trucks flowing past in a slow, constant river. And somewhere along that stretch, between the pines and the mist, a station sat quiet and dark, waiting for the next night thick enough to remember who was out there. Story number 6. The lake wasn't really a lake anymore, not in the way it had been when the old-timers talked about it. The dam had turned it into a long, shallow reservoir that spread out on either side of the highway like a sheet of dark glass. In daylight, the water glinted between skeletal trees and half-submerged fence posts. At night, especially when the fog rolled in off the surface, it became something else entirely. Tasha's truck crept along the causeway like a patient animal, high above the drowned fields. The cab was a small, well-ordered universe. Dash lights in soft blue, gentle hum of the engine, air seat breathing a tiny sigh with each ripple of the road. Tiny charms swung from the visor, a chrome-winged emblem, a faded lanyard with a truck stop logo, moving just enough to prove that gravity was still doing its job. Outside, the fog climbed. It had started low, hugging the water on either side, just a silver haze over the dark. Then, mile by mile, it thickened and rose until it pressed against the underside of the bridge deck, spilling through railings, lifting itself into the lane like something that had decided it wanted to see what traveled above. By 2:10 a.m., the world had shrunk to a short, blurry tunnel of white ahead and behind. Her headlights pushed only a little way into it before their beams dissolved into a bright, humming nothing. Tasha rolled her shoulders, one at a time, and tried to pretend the movement took all the tension with it. She kept her hands light on the wheel, wrists loose, eyes on the smear of centerline that came and went at the edge of the fog. The GPS on the dash said she was halfway across the reservoir, 10 more miles of causeway, then a cloverleaf back onto land. It showed a blue swath of water on either side, the little arrow of her truck inching over it. The route line was straight and confident, ignoring the weather entirely. The CB mumbled with low static. She left it on out of habit, though the channel had been quiet for the last hour. In weather like this, most drivers either hunkered down at the last big plaza or pushed through with all their attention turned inward. The first hint that something was off came as a faint bloom of red in the fog. It started as the vaguest of tints, a blush where everything else was dull gray. As she rolled closer, it separated into 2 steady points, taillights floating in the white ahead, low and unmoving. For a heartbeat, they looked disembodied, like a pair of watchful eyes at the far end of a tunnel. Tasha eased off the throttle. Her truck's deep note dropped, gentle and compliant. She settled into a slower roll, watching the lights. They didn't get any closer. They didn't fall away either. They hung at the same distance, like a mark on the horizon that refused to behave. She checked the mirrors. Fog. The guardrails were whispers of darker gray along the edges. Beyond them, only pale blankness where water and night and sky all braided together. The CB crackled once, then picked up a thin, wavering voice as if from a long way off. Southbound on the dam road, you're not alone out there, driver. The words were washed in static, the vowels stretched. Tasha reached for the mic with one hand, eyes never leaving the red glows ahead. Go ahead, southbound, she said. This is northbound on the waterway. Got a vehicle about a quarter mile in front. Anybody else up here? Silence hummed for a moment. The only sound was the contented murmur of the truck and the soft squeak of the wipers. Then you're seeing the lead, the voice replied, a little clearer now. Male, older, thick with the slow drawl of someone who had been on more backroads than interstates. Just tuck in and stay between the rails. Bridge likes company in fog. There was something old-fashioned in the sound of him. Not just the accent, but the way he spoke into the mic. Slow, deliberate, like he was sharing a campfire story instead of traffic tips. Under his words, Tasha heard another noise, an almost musical hum, like big tires over jointed concrete, with a rhythm that didn't quite match the thrum under her feet. She narrowed her eyes at the lights ahead. The fog was turning them into little halos, soft-edged, breathing red. "You with the lead?" she asked. "You could say that." A low chuckle crept through the static. "Just keep your nose pointed at him. Don't get too close, don't drop too far back. You'll be on dirt before you know it." "Dirt? There's no dirt up here," she said lightly, but some part of her tightened. "It's causeway all the way." "That's what they say now," the voice replied. "Wasn't always. Underneath that water's an old two-lane. Folks forget how roads stack." Her headlights caught the faint shimmer of guardrail to the right, beads of moisture along the top rail glowing like a string of pearls. Beyond, a bank of fog thicker and darker where it hunched over what had once been a river valley full of fields. The taillights in front pulsed a little brighter as the unseen driver tapped his brakes, then they settled again. The truck that owned them was still only suggestion, a darker thickness inside the fog, a silhouette that seemed to flicker if she looked at it too hard. She adjusted, keeping that same elastic distance, not crowding, not losing. The hum of her own engine mingled with something else now, faint but there. A second note higher and more rattling, the kind older diesels used to have when they worked harder than they were built for. "Lot of water under you tonight," the CB voice went on conversationally. "Fog comes off it. Different than from fields, thicker, likes to rise, then drop right back down once you've riled it." "Feels like I'm in a cloud," Tasha admitted. Her shoulders had relaxed without her noticing. Having someone, to follow turned the white from enemy to environment. Clouds kinder, don't hide as much." A brief rustle, the sound of a thermos lid knocked lightly. "You hear much about the old highway?" "Bits," she said. "Guys at the truck stop talk about it. 2 lanes, no shoulder, no median. They shut it down when they flooded the valley." "They moved most of it," he corrected gently. "Laid the new stuff higher, straighter. But some stretches are still down there. You're running right over a place where trucks lined up nose to tail on foggy nights, same as now. Only thing between and the water was white paint and a prayer." Her gaze slid again to the guardrail, the barely there shadow of it pulsing as her own headlights cut past. For a second, she pictured another line of trucks, far below, ghost beams pushing through drowned fog. "And accidents," she said. "Yeah," the voice said quietly, "and accidents." No images followed the word, just a soft, slow acknowledgement that floated in the cab air like another kind of fog. No screeching metal, no broken glass, just the knowledge that sometimes the lines weren't enough. Ahead, the taillights brightened, then began a slow, deliberate drift toward the left. The glow smeared sideways through the fog as the unseen truck changed lanes. Tasha frowned. "We're in the right lane, there is no left out here." "Tonight there is," the voice said. "Shift over gentle, shoulders gone short up ahead. Water ate more concrete than the map remembers." Her hands hesitated on the wheel for only a beat. Then she eased left, feeling the faint, granular texture of old repairs under her tires as they crossed the worn lane line. There should have been rumble strips, but there were none. The truck's motion was smooth, almost too smooth. For a brief instant, as she centered herself in the left lane that wasn't supposed to exist, the fog ahead thinned. She saw not more than 30 yards past where her right wheels would have been, a knuckled bite taken out of the road. A slumping place at the edge. Wet blackness pooled there, where foundation had crumbled. A shallow, water-glossed hollow invisible from a distance, wide enough to catch a tire and pull. Then the fog flowed back in, covering it in white. Her skin cooled, a slow tide from face to fingertips. "Didn't see anything on the alerts," she murmured. "Been sliding bit by bit," the voice said. "State got it on a list somewhere. Lists don't drive trucks in the night, though. We do." The taillights ahead held steady in the left lane that wasn't. As she watched, they seemed to climb just slightly, riding higher than they should. For a second, Tasha thought the other truck had hit a rise in the pavement. Then she realized the horizon line of fog itself had shifted. It was as if the lead truck had settled onto a different grade, some older, buried road that ran just under the surface of the causeway. Static scuffed the edges of the channel. The man's voice came through softer now. "Bridge gets lonely when they change its bones," he said. "It remembers the old weight, the old patterns. Fog helps it sort things out now and then. Lets us line up how we used to, show you where it gives a little." "Us," she repeated. "Convoy from way back," he said. "We ran this in nights before the dam when you could see porch lights on both sides. Folks moved when they heard us common, kids at the windows, coffee on the stove, dogs howling at every Jake break. Good nights, until they were." The next words came slower, woven carefully. "We didn't all make the move to the new bridge the way we were supposed to. Some of us stuck." The air in the cab didn't grow colder, but it felt denser, full of something unsaid. Tasha looked past the glowing blur of the taillights into the deep white ahead. For a moment, in the reach of her beams, she thought she saw outlines, trailer corners, rounded hoods, mirror arms. A faint suggestion of more trucks stretched out in a column, each pair of lights overlapping the next. They were all wrong for this decade. Narrower cabs, curved fenders, logos from companies that had been bought and sold and renamed a dozen times. Their marker lights winked through the fog in soft, amber chains. They weren't really there, not in the way her own truck was, but the image settled over the causeway like a translucent second skin. "Why help me?" she asked quietly. "Old habit," he said. "You see someone in the white, you give them a lane and a line to follow. We can't haul anymore, but we can still do that. And maybe it keeps us from driving the same mile twice." His last words echoed, reminding her of stories heard in lounges and over coffee. The ones about loops, about roads that folded in on themselves on foggy nights. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked, pulling off. There was a pause. If a ghost could shrug, it sounded like that. "When the fog's like this," he said, "there isn't really an off, just here or not here. We know here. Seems as good a place as any to spend the bad weather." Ahead, the taillights began to drift back right, slow and measured. Tasha followed, letting the wheel roll under her palms. The pavement felt more solid now, the faint, subtle sway of bridge structure beneath them evening out. "You'll see the signs in a minute," he added. "You're past the worst of it. Road'll remember its new shape from here." Her GPS pinged softly, as if to agree. A tiny icon for the upcoming interchange slid onto the edge of the screen. The little arrow of her rig was almost at the end of the blue water segment. The fog loosened by degrees, its tight-knit fibers unraveling into thinner veils. Overhead, the impression of a sky returned, a darker darkness above the white. The guardrails sharpened at the edges. Drops of moisture on the glass took on individual shapes again. A reflective rectangle loomed out of the mist. "End of bridge, reduce speed." She hadn't seen the start of bridge sign on the other side hours before. The weather hadn't been this thick then. "Looks like the home stretch," the man's voice said. It was fainter now, hanging at the edge of the channel. "You'll feel land under you in about 30 seconds. It's different. You'll know." "Thank you," Tasha said, and meant it with a depth that surprised her. "Just keep your lights on for the next one," he replied. "Sometimes all anybody needs is to know someone ahead." The taillights in front of her brightened once, as if in acknowledgement, or perhaps it was only another brake tap. Then, very gently, they began to fade. No turnoff, no sudden acceleration. They simply thinned in the fog the way lights do when a curtain is drawn between you and them. One moment, they were solid markers in the white. The next, they were smear, then suggestion, then gone. Tasha rolled on. A subtle thump came up through the chassis as her front wheels hit the landside expansion joint. The sound was soft but distinct, like crossing a threshold. The damp smell of water began to give way, thread by thread, to the sense of soil and road salt, of leaf mold from the trees ahead. The fog broke in patches, torn by rising ground and thicker woods. Gap by gap, the world widened. Overpasses loomed and resolved into concrete forms. Exit signs appeared with familiar fonts and arrows that actually led somewhere. In her mirrors, the low outline of the causeway was receding, half sheathed in its gauzy shawl. For a fleeting second, she saw other shapes along it, a staggered band of dim, amber points, like a caravan moving in perfect, patient rhythm. Then a curve in the land took the view away. By the time she pulled into the first truck stop on solid ground, the fog behind her had become just another low cloud bank on the horizon. Sodium lights bathed the lot in a flat, reassuring yellow. The smells here were warm and immediate: diesel, frying oil, the sharp tang of window cleaner. Inside, pinned up near the cashier under a curl of duct tape, was an old black and white photograph. It showed a line of trucks crossing what had to be the same valley before the dam, two-lane blacktop road running between fields and barn lights. Chrome gleamed on rounded hoods. Trailers bore logos for companies Tasha had only ever seen on vintage toy rigs. In the corner, somebody had written a year in pencil, the numerals smudged but readable. She stared at it long enough that the clerk glanced over. "My granddad took that," the clerk said. "Used to run that road. Said fog'd come rollin' up out of the river there, and you just tucked in behind whoever had the brightest lights and hoped they knew where the ditch was." Tasha's fingers ghosted over the image, not quite touching the glass of the frame. The line of trucks in the picture looked solid, real, bound to their time. Somewhere under new water and new concrete, their route still traced itself invisible. "Looks like they did," she said. "Most nights," the clerk replied. "Most nights everybody made it home." Later, back in her cab, with the truck parked and the world outside softened by a lighter, friendlier mist, Tasha sat in the quiet a moment longer than usual before lying down. The hum of other engines idling in the lot came through the walls like a low, communal heartbeat. She reached up and switched on the CB for no real reason. The speaker gave a sleepy hiss. Somewhere, faint and far away, a man's voice drifted through, not quite clear enough to make out words, just the tone, calm, steady, as if reminding someone to take the left a little early, to give the white a little more room. She let it play her to sleep, the sound of long-ago caution and company layered over the present hum. Out on the causeway, the fog folded and unfolded across the lanes. New trucks crossed, guided by GPS and paint and plain old luck. Somewhere just below the surface of the night, dim taillights glowed in a line only the fog could see, keeping pace. Story number 7. The winter road crossed the lake in a straight white line, laid over ice thick enough to hold the weight of worlds. In daylight, it was a pale scar running across the frozen surface, flanked by low snow berms and scattered pine clumps on distant shores. At night, when the fog crawled low over the ice and the sky pressed close with clouds, it felt less like a road and more like a guess. Eli's rig rolled out onto the lake with a kind of careful resignation. The tires hissed softly over packed snow, chains murmuring a muted metal lullaby. The weight of the loaded trailer moved behind him like a slow thought. Inside the cab, the air was dry and warm, tinged with coffee and the faint plastic smell of the dash. The heater worked hard, sending waves of heat around his boots and up his legs, trying to chase away the memory of the cold outside. The dashboard glowed a gentle green, needles steady, digital numbers calm. The only other illumination came from the headlights, two cones of pale, flattened light pushing into fog. The fog didn't belong here. Not really. This was the kind of place that ought to be clear and sharp in winter, every edge crisp, every sound carrying. But tonight, a low, dense mist had risen off the ice as the temperature bumped just high enough to wake moisture. It hovered knee-high where it wasn't disturbed, then rose in soft curls when the wind nosed at it or the truck passed through. It made the world small. The markers along the road were simple things. spruce branches jammed into snowbanks at intervals, some wrapped with scraps of high-vis flagging, their tips emerging from the fog like dark, uneven teeth. Every few hundred yards, a taller post stood, painted bright orange, with a small reflector nailed near the top to catch headlight beams. On a clear night, those posts would stretch in a long, reassuring line ahead of him. Tonight, they came into being one at a time, appearing out of the gray, shining briefly, then sliding past his shoulder and vanishing into a darker, thicker blur behind. The lake itself was invisible. Somewhere under the snow and ice, there was water in old depths, currents turned sluggish by cold. But from where Eli sat, it might as well have been an endless white plain, sky and ground and fog all woven together. The CB radio was set low, more habit than hope this far out. Most of the other drivers he'd left shore with had opted to wait until morning when the fog lifted. Eli had deliveries stacked across days, and a weather window that would close again by mid-afternoon. He weighed the risks, and decided moving felt better than sitting still and imagining every bad story he'd ever heard about ice roads. His hands rested easy on the wheel, bare fingers warmed by the air coming from the vents. The wheel's textured grip pressed familiar patterns into his palms. Tiny vibrations from the studs in the chains traveled up through the column, subtle but there. He glanced at the GPS more often than he liked to admit. The device showed a simple line across a blue patch labeled lake. His position ticked along that line in steady, measured jumps. Distance to shore, 18.2 miles. The fog billowed a little thicker. The beams of his headlights shortened, their reach eaten almost before they left the truck. Shadows seemed to gather at the edges. His own light thrown back at him made it feel like he was moving through his own reflection. Then, without any buildup, a voice came softly through the CB. "Northbound unit on ice, you got a copy." It was a man's voice, older, with the kind of roughness that came from cold air and long drives. It carried a faint echo, as if the speaker was slightly too far from the mic. Eli's hand went to the radio almost on its own. "Copy," he said, clearing his throat. His voice sounded loud and close in his ears. "This is northbound on the lake. Who's that?" "Name doesn't matter much," the voice replied, gentle. "You're at marker 28. Fog's just thick enough to make you think you're alone." Eli looked to his right. The next orange post slid into view through the fog, the small square reflector flashing back at him like a slow blink. A black stencil near the base read 28, the numbers half obscured by snow and ice. A prickling went along his scalp, not sharp, just a subtle awareness. "Yeah," he said slowly, "that's me. You out here too?" "Something like that," the man said. The background on the channel carried a peculiar sound, soft, rhythmic, like tires over a surface that wasn't quite snow, not quite road. "Watch your speed. Ice gets squirrely past 30 out here when the fog's sitting hard. You want the lake to forget you're on top of it." Eli's eyes flicked to the speedometer. 27. He eased off anyway, letting it settle closer to 25. The truck responded with a gentle shift in tone. The studs scratched a slightly different song on the packed surface. "I was told the ice on this section is good," Eli offered, half conversation, half reassurance to himself. "Checked just last week." "Good as any winter's ice," the voice agreed. "Thick enough where it counts, but it's still just frozen water, and water remembers weight. Run alone too fast in fog like this, it'll start thinking. You're something it needs to pull down and even out." It wasn't the words that pressed on him so much as the way they were said, matter of fact, almost kind, like weather advice. "You local?" Eli asked. "Know the crosses and cracks?" "New M," the man said, softening the tense. "Been a few years since I hauled real loads. Don't worry, I've still got the marks in my head. You're not far off the old logging track that ran here before the dam." "Another road under this one," Eli said, faintly amused. "Seems to be a theme these days." "Roads stack," the man replied. "Tracks on top of tracks, memory on memory, makes it easier for folks like me to find you when visibility's soup. Ahead, the fog brightened slightly. Eli's headlights picked up something low and dark sitting half on, half off the beaten path, a heave in the ice, snow blown in strange shapes around it. He nudged the wheel, giving it a wide berth. "Pressure ridge," the voice said. "New one, good catch." "How'd you know it was there?" Eli asked, a touch quick. "Felt it," came the reply, simple. "Ice hums different when it's been pushed up from below. Sound carries through it like wood grain carries stain. You start listening long enough, it'll talk to you whether you want it to or not." The CB crackled once, as if in agreement. Eli drove on. Markers counted themselves. 30, 31, 32. Each emerged out of the gray like a quiet exhale, then slid away into the rear view where fog swallowed them. He became aware, in that strange, stretched way of foggy nights, of another sound threaded under the familiar ones. It was faint as breath on glass, an additional engine note, higher and thinner than his, keeping pace just at the edge of hearing. Now and then, he thought he saw the suggestion of another set of running lights in the mist behind his own reflection on the windshield, pale glows mirroring his movement. "You got someone else on this road?" he asked, a little louder, glancing toward the mirrors. "Thought I was solo tonight." "You're never entirely solo out here," the voice said. "You know that. You park on a pullout, shut everything down, and you still hear rigs in the wires, old CB chatter in the static. Fog just makes the walls thin." Eli thought about the memorials at the shore, modest metal plaques near the boat ramps, a few carved names on wooden posts. Stories you heard over pie and coffee about the winter the thaw came early, about a driver who trusted old ice a week too long. None of them were graphic, just the fact of them was weight enough. He made himself breathe slower. "How far to shore?" he asked. 14 if you keep it clean," the answer came. "You'll know you're close when the fog lifts enough for you to see the tree that doesn't belong." "The what?" "You'll see it," the man said, and there was something almost like a smile in the word. Time softened. The road under the tires stayed the same, packed whiteness, occasional faint rumble over old cracks. The world on either side remained a blank white ocean, the horizon a wall of soft gray. Inside the cab, Eli's small universe held. Warm air, faint coffee smell, the glow of gauges, the gentle swing of a lucky keychain tapping the dash now and again. "Ever think about not coming back out here?" Eli asked after a while. It wasn't exactly clear whether he meant himself or the man on the radio. "Didn't have much say in it after the last time," the voice answered. "But no, wouldn't have if I'd been offered. There's something about Bane, the only set of lights in a fog like this that makes the rest of the world feel quieter. Like all the noise fell off the edges and left just you and the line you chose." That hit something in Eli that had nothing to do with ice or weather. The nights out here were when his thoughts lined up cleanest, when the chaos of schedules and phone calls and little life corners shrank down to the simple act of going forward. Ahead, the fog thinned just a fraction. The world widened by a degree, and there, to the right of the road where nothing but low shrubs should be, rose a single, tall pine. It stood alone on the ice, improbably rooted, dark trunk cutting a vertical mark through the gray. Frost limned its needles in white. No other trees were near it. The shore was still miles away. It was a tree entirely out of place. He slowed, more in awe than suspicion, and rolled past. "Why is there a pine in the middle of the lake?" he asked, voice softer now, almost reverent. "Because it was there before they flooded it," the man said. "Top of a little hill. They left it. Roots are in dirt 20 feet down, but it remembers the sky. Ice grows around it every year, and every year it reminds folks who see it that land's still under there somewhere." Eli watched it slide by in the mirror, a dark streak swallowed gradually by white. "That's your halfway bell," the man continued. "Ice is better from here, fog startin' to lose interest." He was right. The mist ahead frayed into lighter bands. Shapes suggested themselves at the edges, distant shorelines becoming more than rumor. Eli could just make out the faint rise of land, low hills like shoulders tucked under snow. The GPS chimed quietly, an update on ETA. The icon for the ramp off the ice road onto the main highway blinked into existence a few miles ahead. "You'll be off Metal Water in 20, the voice said. "Road turns back to something dirtier, something that knows how to crack without swallowing you whole." The CB went quiet for a moment. Eli almost asked another question, about how you learned to hear ice hum, about what it felt like when the lake did remember you. But the answer pressed in around him without needing words. "Hey," the man said finally, voice thinner with distance. "When you hit shoreline, give a nod to the snowplow blade by the sign. They bolted it there the year we didn't all make it. Good steel. Worked hard. Deserves a hello now and then." Eli's grip on the wheel softened. "I will," he said. "And next time it's like this," the voice added, "and you're thinking about whether to wait till morning or roll, don't be afraid to sit it out." A pause. The sound of air moving past a mic as if someone had turned their head. "Fog, not going anywhere. Road'll still be here after sunrise. Doesn't mind waiting on you." Static rose gently, like wind through reeds. Then so low he almost missed it came a name. Eli. He hadn't told the man his. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Outside, the fog had torn wide enough to show him shore in earnest now, a darker, solid line where pines stood thick and patient. The CB hissed. No words rode the sound now, just the soft, featureless noise of empty channel. The ramp off the ice appeared shortly after, a low mound of packed snow and plowed gravel leading up to a sign half buried in drift. Someone had bolted an old snowplow blade to its base, painted bright orange, a few names scrawled in marker along the curve. Snow had crusted in its hollows. Ice beard hung from one edge. As Eli rolled past, he dipped his head. "Hello," he said quietly to the plow, to the shore, to the weight under the ice that had decided to let him pass. "And thanks." The tires bit into proper pavement. The feel of it was different immediately, grittier, more textured. The sound in the cab shifted as if someone had retuned an instrument. The fog broke apart further, revealing the suggestion of stars above thin clouds and the dark shoulders of land rising on both sides. Behind him, the white plain of the lake stretched out, serene and unremarkable. The line of the winter rode a faint scar across it. No marker post stood taller than the rest. No solitary pine jutted where it had no right to be. In the cab, the CB muttered with new life, other drivers, further inland, talking about slippery on-ramps, and whether the coffee at the next stop was worth the pull-in. Ordinary noise, comforting in its own way. Eli left the channel open, listening. Somewhere under the casual chatter there was a deeper hum, the memory of tires on lake ice, the echo of stories told soft in fog. As the miles on solid ground slid under his wheels, the thought settled over him like a second blanket. Out there, when the white came down and the world shrank to a narrow line, the road on the water wasn't entirely his to manage alone. Old tracks, old voices, old weight, they moved with him, patient and watchful. It made the night feel less empty. And for a long time after, whenever fog rose low and thick over flat places, he found himself listening not just for trouble, but for the quiet, steady reassurance of someone who'd already crossed ahead.